Lonely widow found cowboy half dead, not knowing he would save her heart. The scream cut through the afternoon like a knife through cloth. Eleanor froze, her hands deep in the soil of her garden, dirt under her fingernails, sweat on her brow. The sound wasn't animal. She knew animal sounds. After 3 years on this isolated rancher's property, 3 years of solitude that had become both sanctuary and prison, she knew the difference between a coyote's howl and a calf's cry. This was human. This was pain. She stayed still. Just listened. The wind picked up across the prairie, carrying dust and something else, a weight, a presence, like death announcing itself to the land. Eleanor straightened slowly, one hand pressing against her lower back where years of hard work had left its mark. The scream didn't come again, but she heard something else now, the faint, wet sound of breathing, labored, desperate. 3 years ago, Eleanor would have run toward that sound. 3 years ago, Eleanor had believed that the world rewarded kindness. She wiped her hands on her apron, a motion so ordinary it felt like a betrayal, and walked toward the barn. The rifle hung where it always hung, above the door frame, within reach of her, a line every time she stepped outside. Thomas, her husband, had taught her to shoot before he taught her to love. Or maybe they were the same thing. A woman alone needed both skills to stay alive. The rifle was cold in her hands. She walked due west, toward the ridge where the cottonwood trees bent their heads like old men in prayer. The sun was bleeding orange across the horizon, and the shadows were growing long. In an hour, it would be dark. In an hour, whatever was out there would either find its own way to survival, or it wouldn't. The figure lay 30 yards past the tree line. Eleanor's breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition. The body was sprawled in the dust, like something broken and cast aside. A cowboy, by the look of him. Dark shirt torn open, revealing a chest heaving with effort. His hat had fallen several feet away, and his hair, dark, matted with blood, caught what remained of the day's light. He wasn't moving. Eleanor raised the rifle, not pointing it at him, but keeping it close. Habit. Protection. In this land, even the dying could be a trap. She'd learned that lesson 3 years ago, when Thomas rode into an ambush outside the settlement, shot down by men who wore badges and called themselves the law. He'd believed in justice. He'd died believing in it. Eleanor had stopped believing in a lot of things after that. She stepped closer. The cowboy's eyes were closed. His breathing was there, though shallow, rattling. A bullet wound on his left shoulder, another below his ribs. His hands were scarred, rough as tree bark, and there was dirt under his fingernails like he'd been clawing at the earth itself. Her rifle trembled slightly, just slightly. "Don't move," she said, though he wasn't moving, though he probably couldn't move. His eyes opened. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they found hers with an intensity that made her step back. There was still life in him, still will, still the dangerous spark of someone who hadn't quite finished fighting. "Please," he said. His voice was gravel. It was the last breath of someone running from something or toward something, maybe both. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She'd heard that word before, please. She'd said it herself, kneeling beside Thomas in the dust, pleading with a world that didn't listen, pleading with God, if he was listening. Pleading with the men who shot her husband that this wasn't how the story was supposed to end. The world didn't care about her pleas then. "Water," he whispered. "There's men following. They'll be here soon. Just water." Eleanor looked back toward her property. The cabin was a quarter-mile off, smoke rising from the chimney where she'd left the stove going. The well was 30 yards to the east. The rope and bucket were still there, right where she'd left them that morning. She could see it all from here. She could see it all, and she could choose not to. That was the thing about solitude, it clarified choice. Out here, there was no one to judge her for turning away. No one to know. This man would die either way. The desert had a way of taking what it wanted. Mercy and cruelty looked exactly the same out here in the end, just different speeds toward the same destination. The cowboy's eyes closed again. His breathing softened. He was fading. In an hour, Maybe less, it would all be over. Eleanor stood there with the rifle in her hands, and she felt something shift inside her. Not kindness. She was too far gone for that. Too scarred and too angry. But something like recognition. This man lying in the dust. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a question. He was what happened when mercy became a choice instead of an instinct. He was everything Eleanor had learned not to believe in, lying bloody in the sunset light, asking her to prove herself wrong. She could stay strong, stay alone, stay safe. Or she could remember what it felt like to be someone who ran toward the screams instead of away from them. Eleanor lowered the rifle. It took effort. It took something she thought she'd lost. She walked to the well without looking back. Her hands moved with the rhythm of 3 years of practice. Hand over hand on the rope, the bucket dropping into darkness, finding water. The rope was thick and familiar in her palms. She'd pulled this bucket 1,000 times in silence, in solitude, in the quiet of her own survival. This time, she pulled it for someone else. The water sloshed over the edge as she carried it back. The cowboy's eyes flickered open when she knelt beside him, tipping the bucket toward his lips. He drank desperately, water spilling down his chin, mixing with blood and dust. His hand came up, weak, trembling, and touched her wrist. Just for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered. Eleanor didn't answer. She set the bucket down and looked at the wound on his shoulder. Deep but not impossible. She'd stitched up worse things on animals. Maybe she could stitch up a man. Maybe she had one more act of mercy left in her before the desert took her too. "The men following you," she said quietly. "Who are they?" His eyes found hers again, and there was something in them now, something like gratitude or confession, or the beginning of a story that neither of them had asked for. "The kind who don't give up," he said. "The kind who finish what they start." Eleanor stood, the rifle heavy in her hands once more. Behind her, the cabin waited. Her solitude waited. Her safe silence waited, patient as stone. Ahead of her lay a choice that would change everything. A choice between the person she'd become and the person she used to be. She looked down at the bleeding stranger, and she realized something that made her chest tight. She didn't know which direction was salvation anymore. His fever broke on the 4th night, and Eleanor found him crying. Not the loud kind of crying, the kind that shattered silence, but the quiet kind. The kind where a man lies still in a bed that isn't his, in a room he doesn't recognize, and lets water run down his temples into the pillow beneath his head. His eyes were closed, but tears moved across his cheeks like rain on dust. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her small bedroom, the room where Thomas had died, where she'd moved the stranger to keep him warm through the worst of it. She held a clean cloth and a cup of broth that had gone lukewarm. For a moment, she didn't move. She'd learned to respect a man's private moments, especially when those moments looked like breaking. But when she stepped into the room, his eyes opened. He looked at her like she was a ghost, like he wasn't sure she was real. His hand came up slowly, still weak, still trembling, and he touched the bandage wrapped around his shoulder. His fingers traced the stitches she'd made, the careful loops of thread that held his wound closed. "You're real," he said. His voice was rough, still scarred from the bleeding inside. "The fever's gone," Eleanor said. She set the broth down on the table beside the bed. "You've been here 4 days. Mostly asleep." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were different now, clearer, but also deeper, like something had shifted behind them. Like the fever had burned away whatever he used to pretend to be, leaving only truth behind. "My name," he said slowly. "Do you know it?" Eleanor shook her head. She'd searched his clothes for any sign of who he was. There was nothing. No letters. No badge. No markings. Just a man with bullet holes in his body and a past that had caught up with him in her prairie. "You haven't told me," she said simply. "I don't know it," he whispered. Eleanor's hands went still. She'd seen wounded men before, but something about this was different. He wasn't confused. He wasn't delirious. He was being honest about something deeper than pain. "The wounds," he continued, looking down at his chest where the bandages wrapped him like a second skin. "They're not new. None of them. He touched a scar on his ribs, old, pale, years deep. Then another on his arm, and another on his jaw. I've been shot at, cut, left for dead more times than... He stopped. His jaw clenched. I don't remember who I was before the blood started. Eleanor pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. She didn't speak. Sometimes silence was the only honest thing you could offer a person who was telling you the truth about themselves. There's a life behind these scars, he said. I can feel it, like memories that won't quite come. But every time I try to grab them, there's just dust and blood and the feeling of running. Eleanor thought of her own scars, the ones you couldn't see, the ones that lived inside her chest where Thomas had been shot down, the ones that never fully healed because she wouldn't let them. Maybe that's mercy, she said quietly, not remembering. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of two people who'd been broken by the world and were learning how to keep living anyway. Over the next weeks, the stranger became part of the rancher's quiet life. Eleanor moved him to the front room once he could walk with support. She brought him the tasks that didn't require full strength, mending leather, oiling tools, sitting on the porch watching the horizon. He worked with his hands, as if his hands remembered things his mind had forgotten. Patient, precise, careful. She asked no questions about his past. He offered no explanations. It was an unspoken pact between them, a cowboy carrying secrets and a widow carrying grief, and both of them learning to sit in the same room without pretending. But there was something else happening too, something neither of them had expected. One evening, she found him on the porch at sunset. The light was gold and soft, and it caught the lines of his face, lines that spoke of hardship, but also of something gentler that was emerging. He was holding a horse's bridle, mending the leather strap where it had frayed. His hands moved with such care that Eleanor found herself watching longer than she meant to. "You good with horses?" she said. "Not a question." "Better with them than people," he replied. "Horses don't ask you who you are. They just know whether you're safe or not." Eleanor sat beside him. The silence between them was different now, not lonely, but full. Like two people who'd learned to speak without words. "The stitches are healing well," she said, gesturing to his shoulder where the wounds had begun to close over. "Because you're good at healing," he said. He turned to look at her. "I was dying when you found me, and you brought me back." "I could have left you," Eleanor said. It was true, and they both knew it. "Yes," he said, "but you didn't." And that was when Eleanor realized something that terrified her. She was beginning to care whether this stranger lived or died. She was beginning to feel something like hope again, and hope was dangerous. Hope was what happened when you opened your heart to someone. And Eleanor had learned that hearts could be shattered by the law, by fate, by the simple cruelty of a world that didn't care about your love. 2 weeks later, Eleanor rode into town for supplies, flour, salt, ammunition. The general store was quiet, dusty, the kind of place where time moved slow. But when she tied her horse to the post outside, she noticed someone she didn't recognize. A man in a sheriff's coat, standing at the edge of the settlement, talking to the storekeeper, asking questions. When she stepped outside with her supplies, he turned and looked at her. His eyes were cold and methodical, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone hunting something. "You live out on the eastern property?" he asked. "An outlaw's property," he might as well have said. "I do," Eleanor replied carefully. "Anyone else out there with you?" Eleanor's hands tightened on her supplies. Behind her, she could feel the weight of the question. She could feel the stranger, still healing, still nameless, waiting in her cabin, unaware that the past had finally found him. "Just me," she lied. The word came out smooth, practiced. It surprised her how easily she could do it. The sheriff studied her face like he was reading a map. After a moment, he tipped his hat. "If you see anyone out there who doesn't belong, you come find me. There's a man we're looking for. Dangerous. Has a distinctive scar." He gestured to his jaw. "Comes with a reputation." Eleanor nodded, said nothing. She untied her horse and rode home as slowly as she could manage, her heart moving faster than her horse's hooves. When she reached the cabin, he was waiting on the porch. He knew. He could read it in her face like he could read everything else, without words. "They're close," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor set her supplies down. She looked at this man who'd saved her as much as she'd saved him, this cowboy with no name and too many scars, and she understood in that moment that the choice she'd made on that first sunset, the choice to save him, was about to demand everything from her. "We need to talk," she said quietly, "about who you really are." And as the sun began to set again over the prairie, Eleanor realized that some questions, once asked, can never be unheard, and some truths, once spoken, can never be taken back. The gunshot shattered the morning like glass. Eleanor woke with her hand reaching for the rifle that leaned against the bedpost. The sound had come from the front of the cabin, not close enough to be inside, but close enough that the bullet hole would be in the wood. A warning. A threat. The language of men who didn't waste time with words. She was dressed and at the door before she thought about it. The stranger was already there, standing at the window, watching the darkness. His shirt hung open where the wounds still pulled tight. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, a gun she didn't know he had, a gun that meant he'd been armed the whole time he was healing in her home. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Eleanor grabbed her rifle instead. "Who is it?" "Men looking for a man who doesn't exist anymore," he said. His voice was steady, but she could hear the current of something running underneath. Regret, maybe. Or resignation. Outside, a voice called out. Rough. Commanding. The voice of a sheriff or someone who'd worn a badge long enough that the authority had soaked into his bones. "We know you're in there," the voice shouted. "The outlaw named Dalton Cross. We've got the whole property surrounded. Come out hands empty, and we'll take you in peaceful. Fight us, and we burn the cabin with both of you inside it." Eleanor's breath caught. Dalton Cross. The name meant something, a story she'd heard in whispers at the general store. An outlaw, a bank robber, a man who'd killed a lawman 3 years ago, a man who'd disappeared into legend and dust. She turned to look at him, really look at him, and she saw it then, the weight of that name settling onto his shoulders like he was remembering it for the first time. Dalton Cross. That was who his body had always known it was, even when his mind had lost it. "You need to go," he said. He didn't look at her. "Take my horse. Head south. Don't stop until you reach the next settlement." "No," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, no," she repeated. Her voice was steady. "You don't get to decide what happens to me. Not after everything." He finally turned to face her, and she saw something break in his expression. Something she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror every day since Thomas died. The look of someone realizing they'd brought danger to the door of someone they cared about. "My name is Dalton Cross," he said. Each word fell like a stone. "I robbed a bank in Missouri. The sheriff who came after me, I shot him. I didn't mean to kill him, but I did. And I've been running ever since. 3 years. Through 6 states. Through blood and dust and the kind of darkness that wears a man down until he forgets he was ever anything else." He paused. "Then you found me. And for the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to be someone worth saving." "Then stay," Eleanor said. "Fight them with me." "I'm wanted for murder," he said. "Even if I killed every lawman out there, there'd be more." "This doesn't end, Eleanor. It only ends when I'm in a grave or in a cell. And I won't drag you into that ending." Another gunshot, this time through the front window. Glass scattered across the floor like stars falling. Eleanor flinched, but Dalton didn't move. "Last chance," the voice outside shouted. "You come out now, or we start shooting through the walls." Dalton moved to the back of the cabin. Eleanor followed him. He was already reaching for the saddlebag he'd hidden behind the wooden crates in the corner. The bag she'd found once when she was cleaning. The bag full of money and old papers and a photograph of a woman she didn't recognize. "This is what I was running from," he said, holding up the photograph. The woman was young, smiling, standing in front of a house that looked like it belonged to a different life. Before the bank robbery. Before any of it. I was supposed to marry her. Her name was Catherine. Eleanor said nothing. She understood now why he wouldn't fight, why he wouldn't stay. The past had weight. It had a gravity that pulled you toward it no matter how hard you tried to escape. She's gone now, he continued. Married someone else. Had a life I couldn't give her. He tucked the photograph back into the bag. But there's money here. Enough for you to leave this place. Start over. Somewhere new. I don't want your money, Eleanor said. Eleanor. He said her name like it was the last word he'd ever speak. Like it held all the things he couldn't say. I love you. That's why I have to go. That's why I can't stay. Because I won't let my past destroy what you've built here. I won't let you die for someone you barely know. The words landed in her chest like bullets. She'd been alone so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to hear those words. To have someone choose her safety over everything else. But she also knew something Dalton didn't yet know. She knew that some people saved your life not by staying, but by showing you that you were worth saving in the first place. That sometimes the greatest love wasn't about remaining. It was about teaching someone they could live again. The gunfire started in earnest now. Bullets raking across the cabin walls. Wood splintering. The sound of men outside shouting orders. Dalton grabbed her hand. I'm going to draw them around to the back. When I do, you take the north horse. The dark one. She knows the way to the settlement. Go. What about you? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. I'm going to make sure they don't follow you, he said. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that he'd already decided. He was going to sacrifice himself so she could live. It was the same choice he'd made when he decided to leave. The same love that had driven him all along. She grabbed his face in her hands and kissed him. Quick. Hard. A kiss that tasted like goodbye and forever at the same time. Then she let go. He disappeared into the smoke and noise outside, and Eleanor ran for the back of the cabin. Her hands were shaking as she saddled the horse. She could hear the chaos outside, gunfire, shouting, the sound of his voice yelling to draw the lawmen away from her escape route. As she rode away from the cabin, dust rising behind her, Eleanor turned back once and saw him standing on the porch, hands raised, surrendering to the men in badges who'd finally caught up with the outlaw named Dalton Cross. Their eyes met across the distance for just a moment, and Eleanor understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes love meant letting someone go toward their own salvation, even when every part of you wanted to keep them close. She rode harder, tears streaming down her face, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd been saved by a man who'd finally learned to save himself. She counted the days by the number of times the sun rose and fell. 37 sunrises, 37 sunsets. Eleanor stood on the porch of the cabin that had become a place of waiting instead of a place of safety. The morning wind moved through the prairie like a breath, carrying dust and the memory of hoofbeats that had long since faded. She'd left the cabin after he surrendered to the lawmen that dawn. She'd ridden to the settlement, found a room above the saloon, and tried to become invisible. But invisibility was harder than she thought. The money he'd left her, she'd hidden it in a cloth bag beneath the floorboards of her new room. She couldn't spend it. Spending it would feel like accepting that he was gone, that what they'd had was finished. So she worked instead. She mended clothes for the women of the town. She helped in the kitchen of the saloon, learning to cook for men who didn't know her name and didn't ask. And she waited. People talked. The outlaw they called Dalton Cross had been arrested. He was being held in a jail 3 territories over, waiting for trial. The judge was harsh. The case was clear. They said he would hang. People said it like it was fact, like it was already decided, like the future was written in dust and blood. But Eleanor didn't believe in futures written that way. She'd learned, in the hours after he surrendered, that futures were made by choices, by actions, by a man who'd spent 3 years running, finally deciding to stop and face what he'd done. On the 38th day, a letter arrived at the saloon. It was brought by a drifter passing through, handed to the owner with a note, for the woman who stayed behind. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was careful, precise. The writing of someone who'd learned to control their actions, even when their heart was breaking. Eleanor, I've confessed to the shooting. I've told them it was an accident, that the sheriff was corrupt, that he drew on me first. But the words don't matter much in a courtroom where the law is already decided. What matters is that I'm finally telling the truth. About who I am. About what I've done. About how meeting you changed the direction of my entire life. I'm going to clear my name. Not for me. I've made peace with the possibility that I might hang for this. I'm going to clear it for you. So you don't have to spend your life loving a man the law says is a murderer. So you can walk into town and hold your head up without shame. Wait for me. Not because I deserve it, but because you do. You deserve a life that isn't shadowed by my past. And I'm going to do everything in my power to give you that. Dalton Eleanor folded the letter and held it against her chest. In that moment, she understood something. He was fighting for her the only way he knew how. Not with a gun or his fists, but with the truth. With his willingness to face judgment. With his choice to become someone new. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Eleanor attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching as Dalton stood before the judge and told the story of his life. He talked about the bank robbery, about poverty and desperation and choices that seemed right in the moment until they destroyed everything. He talked about the shooting, how the sheriff had been protecting the politicians who'd paid him to eliminate a problem, how it had been self-defense, not murder. And slowly, the truth came out. Witnesses appeared. Letters were introduced. The corruption was exposed like rotten old wood. By the end of the trial, the judge looked at Dalton with something that might have been respect, or might have been simply the recognition of truth. The charges against you are reduced, the judge said. You'll serve 5 years for the bank robbery. For the shooting, the court finds you acted in self-defense. You're free to go, pending your prison sentence. 5 years. It felt like nothing and everything all at once. Eleanor held the words in her heart like a small stone she could carry. He was released after 3 years. Good behavior. Clemency from a governor who'd read the trial records and believed in second chances. Eleanor was waiting at the gate when he walked out. He was different. Older, maybe. The scars on his face had deepened, and his hair had a streak of gray she didn't remember. But his eyes were clear, clearer than they'd ever been. The haunted quality was gone. In its place was something like peace. You came, he said. His voice was rough with emotion. I waited, Eleanor replied. 38 days before you sent the letter. Then 3 years more after that. I worked. I lived. I didn't spend the money you gave me. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes. I was afraid you'd move on, he said. I wouldn't have blamed you. I did move on, Eleanor said. I moved toward you. That's what waiting is. It's not standing still. It's moving in the direction of someone you love. They walked together through the town. People watched. They always did when an outlaw walked free. But Eleanor didn't care anymore what people thought. She'd learned that judgment was easy. Understanding was harder. And love was the hardest thing of all. That evening, they sat on the porch of the cabin she'd moved back into after his trial. The one where she'd brought water to a dying stranger. The one where she'd learned that mercy wasn't a luxury, it was a choice. What happens now? Dalton asked. Eleanor looked at his face, scarred, worn, beautiful in the way that only honest living can make something beautiful. Now, she said, we live. Not perfectly, not without pain, but together. That's the thing I learned from you, Dalton. That survival doesn't mean you have to survive alone. That being broken doesn't mean you can't be whole. It just means your wholeness looks different than the stories told you it would. He reached over and took her hand. They sat like that as the sun set, two people who'd been shattered by the world, who'd found each other in the dust, and who'd discovered that the greatest courage wasn't riding away from danger. It was choosing to stay, choosing to believe that love was worth the risk, choosing every single day to be there for someone else, even when that choice was terrifying. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and quiet and full of possibility. And Eleanor realized in that moment that she'd stopped being a lonely widow. She'd become someone who was loved, someone who was home. And that made all the difference.